Are we on a countdown to a war between the United States and Iran? Benjamin Netanyahu will be in Washington, D.C. tomorrow and have a meeting in the White House on Wednesday. Is that the prelude? Is that the final chapter necessary, the final discussions to something that could potentially come as early as that night? Or have events continued to happen? And certainly the Iranians are continuing to make statements of their own, and diplomacy continues to happen, that maybe we're getting close to the point of where people realize, holy snap, a war could mean we could get shot as well as we could do some shooting, and maybe President Trump is having some second thoughts. Let's hope that's the case. But to try to parse the tea leaves here and to see what actually is happening, we have back with us for the first time in a long time, Jim Jatras, former U.S. diplomat, GOP Senate Foreign Relation Policy Advisor, former advisor. Right, it's former. It's not current, is it? Okay, I'm going to make sure I didn't make sure to see that word on there. I want to make sure. Jim Jatras. Jim, welcome back to the show. Good to see you.
Daniel, great to be here again. Good to see you too.
Well, listen, the stakes couldn't be higher here about what we're talking about. And as recently as maybe toward the end of last week, the first of this past weekend, it really looked like we were just on a final countdown. So much combat power had been moved into the region, hundreds of C-17 transports, C-5s, all kinds of air defense, air offense missiles throughout the region. Of course, all the combat power in the Arabian Sea. All that together make it look like it was getting ready. But now all of a sudden one wonders, is there some pause and some hesitation with the Trump administration? First of all, before we get into even some of the things that some of the people are saying, what is your understanding of where things are right now?
Well, Daniel, who was it? Napoleon that said the one thing you can't do with bayonets is sit on them. And as far as I can tell, there's been no move to unwind this deployment in the Persian Gulf area. And in fact, it seems to be building up even further, which seems to indicate that they've got to do something relatively soon or back down in some way that would be humiliating for President Trump, unless he could find some gimmick to say, oh, look, we reached an agreement. I've solved my 18th war, whatever it is. And look, let's face it, that's what his tendency is. He wants the quick thing he could say as a win. You know, the bombing back in June, well, we destroyed their nuclear capability. Oh, we kidnapped Maduro. We solved that problem. You know, he'd like to find some way he could do something quick and easy and say it's a win. Or maybe if they can sign on to an agreement that's not a lot different from the JCPOA, which he canceled back during his first term. He said, oh, I brought the Iranians to the table. We've made a big deal here. I'm not sure either of those paths is open to him, though. I don't think that Bibi is going to settle for an agreement that's like the JCPOA. He wants the missile problem taken care of, and the Iranians say they will not negotiate on that. And I think any kind of strike on Iran is not going to be quick and easy like the one back in June. So his options are pretty limited right now to either going through with it, which I think is the reason why Bibi's in town, to put his feet to the fire and make him do something he really doesn't want to do, because it could very well destroy his presidency, set him up for a big disaster in the midterms, which is likely to happen anyway, to tell the truth. Or he'll have to back down in a humiliating fashion, which won't do him any good politically either. I don't see any easy way out for him.
Well, let's take a look at the negotiation and what's even on the table here. Now, people may recall that prior to the U.S. turned out to be an indirect meeting with the Iran that happened a few days ago, is that Secretary of State Marco Rubio came out and said there's 4 things that have to be on the table. He said no nuclear enrichment, no long-range missile program, and no support for proxies. And he said, and they can't kill their people. He said, if you don't talk about those, there's no point in even meeting together. So yeah, those were the 3 there. Plus he added in that particular statement, you know, I think just to give cover to what President Trump had said earlier, which was, oh, this is all about those poor protesters, et cetera. So he's like, yeah, we got to talk about all those. All those was the way he mentioned. Well, Iran today is saying that they are willing to negotiate. Here, if you can put that first full screen up on there. He said Iran said they're willing to dilute their highly enriched uranium, but not zero it out, but only if U.S. international sanctions are lifted. Iranian officials made it clear that this would not be a one-sided deal. Any move to reduce enrichment levels, reduce, not eliminate, would come in exchange for complete sanctions relief, not a partial or temporary measures. This is one of the strongest signals so far that Tehran is willing to discuss real nuclear concessions, but only on its terms. Do you see any room at all for Trump to navigate within that narrowing window and still come out with something that he can even claim thinly is a victory without war?
Honestly, I think he would like to do that, even though it's basically going back to a deal that could have been on the table months or even years ago. I mean, again, what was the JCPOA designed to do? Is to limit Iran's nuclear program. There was all talk about taking enriched material to Russia and all sorts of things. This could have been done at any time. And you see nothing in there about the other three items, about the missiles, about the proxies, or about demonstrators. So I don't see where there's any room for this deal that doesn't look like a humiliating retreat for the United States. On the other hand, if I were the Iranians, even this deal, in exchange for promises of sanctions relief, how likely do you think it is that sanctions relief would actually materialize? I mean, you can bet that not only the Israelis, but their proxies, their puppets in Congress would be 1,000% against that. And there was no way that they could actually deliver on sanctions relief, no matter what the deal was. So I just don't see any path forward with this.
Yeah, that's part of the worrisome part here, because then if you don't have where either the Iranian side or the U.S. can actually agree to those terms, then you have what could be coming next. And this is what Foreign Minister Arakchi said. I think it was this morning. Gary, if you can play that second video or that first video.
Their military posturing in our region does not frighten us. We are people of diplomacy, and we are also people of war. Not in the sense that we seek war, rather we are prepared for war so that no one dares to wage war against us. We believe in diplomacy because we believe in logic. If they choose the path of diplomacy, we will follow the same path. If they speak to the Iranian people with respect, we will respond with respect. And if they speak in the language of force, we will respond in the language of force.
Now, about 3 weeks ago, President Trump was asked in one of those press gaggles in front of the Oval Office. They said, hey, Iran is saying that if you attack them this time, then they're going to retaliate against American bases in the region and against the Israelis. And Trump said, they said that before. They said that in June last year, and they ended up not doing it. They had this little thing about Al-Udeid, which we knocked down, and everything was good to go. Arakchi here is saying, that was yesterday, he says, if you fight, we're going to fight. And the Ayatollah a couple of days ago reemphasized again that they would attack both American bases and Israelis right away. There's no symbolic strike. There's no little one. The first bombs start falling, we're going to fire after. Is Trump right that that's what they did before, but that they don't mean it?
I had seen a report, I don't know if it's confirmed, that we had floated that idea of kind of a repeat of June, that we would come in with some kind of a token attack on something and they would respond in some token way and we could call it another win and kick the can down the road for a while. I don't know if that's true or not, but if I were the Iranians, they said they're not afraid of war. I think they should be afraid of war, because if we do come in this time and we have to take them at their word that they will respond massively, I think we could see a very massive attack on them from the get-go. I think that's the reason that these forces are being assembled there, that we realize if we do attack the Iranians, it's got to be successful, and it's got to be successful quick. As Colonel McGregor and others have pointed out, we don't have the sustained resources to carry this thing on for a long time. And if it fails in its initial attack to presumably decapitate the Iranian leadership and to destroy their missile capability, which is the main thing they have that would not only threaten our forces, our bases, but also the Israelis, it's got to be successful, and it's got to be successful quick. So I think we could be looking, if the attack does come, at some very massive damage to the Iranians. And the other thing, Daniel, that I think everybody has to worry about is if the Iranians respond with a very, very heavy attack against the Israelis and can do any, not only the kind of damage they did back in June, but a lot more. And there's no end to it. Would the Israelis be, they would be likely to then use their nuclear capability against the Iranians? I mean, they don't have those things for no reason. They have them if they find themselves at extremis, and they very well could be in that situation where they say, well, all the chips are down, and we have no choice but to use our nuclear weapons. Yeah, if I were the Iranians, I'd be very worried about that. But I don't know what alternative they have except to face that possibility.
And what would you imagine as a former diplomat that those statements are probably being communicated behind the scenes from Israel to Iran, that, hey, if this goes bad, then we're going to pull this out. And I can't imagine that Iran wouldn't believe that. So that would seem to mitigate how much damage that they would do. Do you imagine those kind of conversations are going on?
They could be, Daniel, but I don't know that they have to be. I mean, everybody knows what the capabilities are on all sides and what the mentality is on both sides. I think if I were the Iranians, my only question would be not so much would the Israelis be tempted to use their weapons, but how exactly can they deliver them? I mean, I don't know that the route that they used through Azerbaijan during the first round here, 6 months ago, is still available to them. And as I understand it, they have some submarine launch capabilities with their nuclear weapons, but I think their primary delivery would be through air. And can they get their air assets into Iran to deliver a nuclear weapon? I'm not sure. Maybe they can.
Well, let's hope we don't have to find out. But in terms of whether Arakshi was serious and whether Iran would actually follow through with that, or whether it was just an empty threat to try and forestall an attack against them, we had, Gary, if we can go a little bit out of order here, to Trita Parsi in a New York Times piece here recently. He was quoted in there, and he said that he believes there's a strong view on the Iranian side that Trump has an excessive and exaggerated view of Iranian weakness. If diplomacy is to work, these Iranians believe a short, intense war may be necessary to correct Trump's perception and compel him to adopt a more realistic demands. He was actually on our show, Trita Parsi was not too long ago, where he talked about this in a little bit more detail, where he says that there are those in Iran who believe that just kicking the can down the road is not the best course of action, because the can will come back and they will get kicked again. And so they may have calculated that they need to have a short, sharp war where it causes blood and pain on both Israel and American side to, quote, reestablish deterrence. Now, the big problem with that is that's all in the eye of the beholder. And you may think you're going to cause deterrence, but it may just cause them to get more angry, meaning the United States and Israel, and we could have a much bigger war. Do you see that as a possibility?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think what he was telegraphing there was that they might themselves want to trigger a confrontation and a short, quick punishing.
Right. He did make that clear. They would not initiate. No. But if initiation happened, they wouldn't back down.
Well, let's remember, when President Pezeshkian took power, he ran on a platform of moderation that he wanted to try to reopen dialogue with the West, especially with the United States. This was prompted by a lot of people in the Iranian business community that they'd have a lot to gain from that. I think the 6 months ago, back in June or 7 months ago, pretty well established to everybody in Iran that path is closed. That the idea that by restraining themselves, practicing moderation, that they somehow can open up a real dialogue with the Americans isn't going to work. So really now we're down to brass tacks. Either we come up with some kind of a deal that both sides can live with, which I think is very, very unlikely, or one side or the other is going to have to back down. And actually that's going to be us. We'd have to either back down or proceed with something that would be then open-ended. And see, this is where I think what was said there is not necessarily all that useful to the Iranians, because I don't think a short, hard response from the Iranians to any American attack is going to reestablish deterrence. It means that the other side, like you indicated, the other side is going to realize that this is for all the marbles, that we either have to proceed with a very, very devastating attack on Iran, and like we say, the Israelis might even use nuclear weapons, or we would have to back down and admit that Iran won, which I don't see either Mr. Trump or Mr. Netanyahu being willing to do.
And do you think that the Iranians might look at the example from the Red Sea and the Houthis and the United States' inability to knock them out, and you can say the Saudis in the decade before that inability to knock them out, to think that, hey, we just have to not lose. We just have to suck down some missiles and just take this even over time. Do you think Iran, number one, would do that, or number two, could successfully do that, of just eating a lot of missiles, throwing some back, and just surviving?
I think that's the essence of the strategy. And I think that's a good comparison. I guess the only real question is unlike the Houthis, obviously the Israelis haven't used nuclear weapons in Yemen, and I don't think they're likely to. I don't know how heavily we would be willing to bomb and use even more devastating weapons than we used in Yemen against the Iranians. But you're right, it's a much bigger, as a Yemen comparison goes, we're talking about a much bigger country and a much bigger population. But on the other hand, I think we have a much greater motivation by both the Americans and the Israelis that we can't lose this. Because if we do lose it, again, they're also going to be thinking in terms of what are the situation in Ukraine and the Russians, what's coming up with our confrontation with the Chinese. Do we want to be bested in a war by the Iranians? And they may decide when the chips are down, we're going to do whatever we need to do to devastate that country.
One of the things, Jim, that might give substance to the Iranian side thinking that way, that they can't just kick the can down the road, they can't just endure another round because it's going to come back, is this comment here by Senator Britt, who over this past weekend published this and said basically, I'm thankful to the president for continuing to apply maximum pressure on Iran. The Ayatollah has the blood of countless Americans on his hands, and anyone who does business with this murderous regime should think twice. Now they will. So it seems that the U.S. side, and this is one of many that are like this, to where a lot in the United States seem to think that Iran can't do anything that against us. That basically we can go in there and just have our way, like we did with Maduro in Venezuela, we did last year. We can just keep doing this. And so she thinks it's basically no cost to go in. Is she right?
Of course she's not right. Look, you see this kind of absolute evil that these people have conjured in their minds about Iran. Look, I'm no friend of the Islamic regime in Tehran, just like I wasn't a friend of communist regimes in the Soviet Union. But there are certain realities of life that you have to get along with people sometimes, or at least that going to war with them is not always your best option. But when these people have this kind of Manichaean life and light and darkness, good and bad attitude toward other states, and it's a zero-sum game, they must be destroyed. What do you do with that, Daniel? I don't understand. I mean, when you have this kind of mentality that there is no possibility of compromise. I mean, look, that's the other thing I think the Iranians need to be conscious of, even if conceivably there could be some kind of deal where they would agree about enrichment of uranium, or maybe even talk about their missile program or something like that. Wouldn't they just see that as another step to weaken them in preparation for the next round of demands, which are designed at the end of the day to either have regime change in Tehran or to break up Iran as a state? In other words, if I were any country, not just the Iranians and the Russians and the Chinese, anybody else, how do you deal in good faith with a country that, and by the way, Stephen Miller, other people have said this, doesn't feel bound by agreements or by any concept of law or rules of the road when it comes to international behavior? So even if they conceivably could reach an agreement with us, when they look at the mentality of that, which you just quoted, that says, oh, yeah, by the way, you're absolute evil, you must be destroyed, isn't any agreement with us just a way station to that ultimate goal from their point of view?
And listen, I think that one of the things that kind of drives that home a little bit more, it's one thing for a senator who may not really understand much about military affairs, but this here from Jack Keane is something that he said a couple of days ago, and he is not looking for any kind of negotiations.
Even if we got a deal that's favorable to us, I think the preferred option is a military one. Also, this operation would likely not be a limited operation in terms of a one-night operation or 2 nights. This would be a comprehensive campaign combined with the stated purpose to set the conditions for a regime collapse. And that would mean the whole Iranian ecosystem in terms of what composes that regime, what sustains that regime.
So now that's just a talking head. That's just somebody on TV, but he is head of the Institute for the Study of War. He has close ties with a lot of people inside the Trump administration. And you talk about Mike Pompeo, you talk about Lindsey Graham, who has just been livid and rabid almost in talking about they want no negotiations. They just want regime change. So one has to know that at least that's in the ear of the president of the United States. So that tells me that if I'm on the Iranian side, I have to believe that is at least in the thinking, whatever they're saying about negotiations, that's their ultimate objective. What does that mean for the Iranian side?
By the way, where was your red alert siren? Nonsense. I was expecting that. You said Jack Keane. I was expecting that before he came on.
You know what? That's on me, man. I owe that to our leader, or our viewers. I stand corrected.
Yeah. Well, to tell the truth, he's not stating nonsense. I think that's exactly the mentality in Washington, that the ultimate goal, which cannot be turned aside from, is regime change and destruction of Iran, either by putting a puppet regime in there, bringing back Shah Jr. or whatever it's going to be, or by breaking the country up. And I think the Iranians, this is, by the way, when we get to the discussion about Ukraine and Russia, this is, I think, a reality that some of these countries are very loath to admit to themselves, that it's not what they do, or it's not even a question of what agreements they could reach. You must be destroyed. Russia delenda est, Iran delenda est. It must be destroyed. And then any talk of agreements is simply a gimmick or a way station toward that end. How do you negotiate with anybody who has that mentality about you? It was one thing when you're negotiating with somebody, you're saying, okay, can we find a modus vivendi? Can we find some way to live on the same planet together and not get in each other's face, versus negotiating with somebody who says right up front, oh, by the way, we want to destroy you. I mean, remember with Khrushchev and, pounding a shoe on the table, we will destroy you, which maybe was taken out of context. But I think a lot of people took that very seriously. Well, the communists are trying to destroy us. Well, why would that work the other way around when we say to other countries, by the way, our goal is to destroy you? How do you negotiate with that?
And so, I mean, it sounds to me like that it's leaving Iran with this choice of either rolling over, literally giving everything we want, the nuclear enrichment, the missiles, the proxies, etc., and that would buy you a little time, but then leave you utterly powerless. And the next day, either Israel or anybody else can come in, and you would literally be helpless. And I mean, so correct me if I'm wrong, but we're offering Iran the option of either lay down and die by death later, or stand firm and maybe die shortly now, but at least this way you're going to have some missiles to shoot back. I mean, do you see it differently?
No, I think you're exactly right. And basically, we're inviting them to become Gaddafi. You remember Gaddafi basically gave us a nuclear program. They basically said, fine, I saw what you did in Iraq. I don't want to end up like that. I'll meet your terms. We'll come to an agreement. We'll all be out. And we said, great. Now that you're defenseless, let's destroy you, stick a bayonet up your rear end and shoot you in the head. Now, if you're the Iranian leadership, do you want to end up like that? Look, I've always said the Iranians basically have a choice. They can be North Korea or they can be Libya. Which would you rather be?
That's not a choice
I'd rather be North Korea.
To have to make.
Yeah, but that's the position we're putting them in. And frankly, I'm a little surprised they haven't gone for a nuclear breakout up till now. Because if they're looking for real security, say, okay, fine, no more of this nonsense. We don't want to be Libya. We're North Korea now. Back off.
Yeah.
That would make some sense from their point of view, wouldn't it?
We've actually had John Mearsheimer on our show say exactly that. He said, I'm frankly puzzled. They haven't done it already. I don't know why they wouldn't. He said, if I was an Iranian, I would have done it already. So
yeah.
And who knows what may be going on behind the scenes. We actually don't know since June. We don't know for sure what's been going on. So we may get an ugly surprise one day, but we haven't so far. But I want to shift gears a little bit to regional diplomacy and even some domestic diplomacy inside Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu is not a free agent here. He has some real issues he's got to worry about too, because it's one of the things that stood out to me is that at least what's being projected so far is that it's the United States. If there's going to be an offensive initially, apparently it's going to be just the United States by itself, but with no regional allies. And I think until just over the weekend, I think Saudi Arabia and I think UAE said you can use THAAD to defend on our territory. That's not being confirmed, but it's been reported in one source. But otherwise, it's been overtly said you can't use our airspace to attack Iran. So there's nobody with us on this. And then here, just today, I think it was, Gary, if you could put that full screen up there, that a lot of the Muslim countries that we're going to need on our side are livid because of an illegal annexation push by Israel in the West Bank, not even in the Gaza Strip. That's its own simmering issue here. But in Egypt, Indonesia, Jordan, Pakistan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the UAE all condemned Israel's moves in the strongest terms on Monday, according to Saudi Foreign Ministry statement. So they are up in arms about all this. And so Israel has to be careful that they don't take too many actions here that could also sabotage their interest in other places and could actually cause difficulty in getting support to go after Iran. How do you see that?
I don't know what exactly the support is we would want from these countries. Obviously, these are not great military powers themselves. Their forces would not be engaged in any way. The Iranians have made it clear that if they are attacked, they will respond against our forces in the region, presumably not only the naval assets, but all these bases we have surrounding them. I mean, look how aggressive the Iranians are. Look how close they put their country to our bases, and also against the Israelis. I don't know that they would want to attack any of the assets of the countries that host our bases, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris, and so forth. And I think these guys are trying to send a signal to the Iranians, hey, if you're going to hit the American bases on our territory, fine, just don't do anything to us. Now, I don't know if that's going to work with the Iranians. I think the Iranians probably would be careful about that because they know they're going to have to live with these people for a very long time, that they're going to be their neighbors forever. And so it really is not in their interest to attack, Saudis or Emirati, et cetera, assets per se. But I think that's the signal these guys are trying to send. On the one hand, they want to stay on the American good side. On the other hand, they want to make sure that they don't make this a confrontation between them and Iran rather than between the Americans and the Israelis in Iran.
And what about this issues about the West Bank in particular? Does Israel even care whether it's about what they're still trying to do in the Gaza Strip, which continues despite the word ceasefire? There really isn't much of one. It's just a lower level of fire, but there's continuing to be Palestinians killed nearly every day. And then they're trying to take much more aggressive actions in the West Bank. At the same time, they're looking possibly to go after Iran. What is the Israeli strategy here in the Middle East?
I think it's kind of make hay while the sun shines. I mean, if they feel they have a green light to do whatever they want to in the West Bank, and also maybe to step up whatever they're doing in Gaza, they will do that, figuring that the burden of this war, if it comes, is going to be on the Americans. The Israelis are not going to be that strong a participant, except trying to stave off as much damage as they can when the Iranians respond against them. I don't, to tell the truth, I don't think the Saudis, the Emiratis, et cetera, I don't think they give a damn about the West Bank or the Palestinians in general or Gaza. I think they'll bang the drum a little bit, knowing some of their populations care about it, and they want to act like they're on the side of the angels on this, if you want to put it that way. I don't think they actually care as a political matter any more than any more than the Turks or the Egyptians really care. I mean, the Egyptian government will make some of the right noises of concern about Gaza. They're trying to keep a lid on the Muslim Brotherhood, which is their opposition inside Egypt, but they're not actually going to do anything about it. Just like Erdogan is not going to do anything about Gaza or the West Bank from Turkey. They know their populations care about this, but they will try to manage it with some words of sympathy, but they're not going to do anything. Now, I think that's true of the
one of the things you said there.
It's not a word.
Yeah, well, that's a long history of that. But one of the things you said there just kind of caught my attention here. You said the Israelis would basically expect that the U.S. would carry the burden if there's war with Iran.
Yeah.
And so they're ignoring everybody on what they want with making hay while the sun is shining, as you say, in both the West Bank and in Gaza, and to try to get rid of their longtime nemesis up in Iran. I can see how this is in Jerusalem benefit and how this is in their interest, or at least Netanyahu's personal vision of how things should go. How is this America first from Donald Trump to pick up the heavy load and to take it and to risk American lives going after Iran?
Well, the obvious answer is it isn't. And this gets back to, the strategy paper that was released not too long ago, what our posture is in Ukraine and in the Western Pacific and a lot of other places. I think a lot of people have drunk the Kool-Aid saying that Trump is going to pull back into more of a fortress America or Western Hemisphere. We're going to be less engaged in the rest of the world, that the American empire is going to pull back into a more of a multipolar world and will accept other spheres of influence. I think they're reading into something into that isn't there, that what he's doing is reconsolidating our posture in the Western Hemisphere for a more effective force projection into the rest of the world. We have no intention of allowing other centers of power, whether it's the Russians, the Chinese, or the Iranians, to escape from what amounts to American unipolar diktat. We're just reshuffling the deck in terms of projecting power more effectively. So I don't see where there's any prospect that we will pull back from dictating to these countries, and that again brings us back to Iran, and obviously our clients, proxies, or whatever you want to call them in the region, will sway with the wind on that.
Now, you mentioned earlier in this episode here some challenges with what we have with combat power in the region there, and I may have mentioned that if you don't have a ground presence, if you don't have a ground army, you're going to be a lot more limited in what you could do for a regime change, because a lot of missiles historically are not going to bring a country to its knees unless you're ready to go for months and months, which I don't know that we have the capacity here. So if it is the United States, or maybe just the current administration, maybe not even the U.S. per se, But the administration is saying that we want to have this unilateral dictate capability across the world. And so we're just looking to consolidate one place so that we can project in another. Do we actually have the power to pull that off?
I don't see how we do. I don't see it. I mean, if they're looking at Iran, I can't imagine that we would be sending ground forces into Iran. I'm not even sure where we would send them in from. I mean, where would we base them? Where's the point of entry into Iran for these? We're going to have an amphibious assault on the beaches from the Persian. I don't think so. I suppose there are some proxies we could point to on the ground. I mean, I'm sure we've been supporting, some Arab groups in Khuzestan or some Baluchi groups or some Azeri groups that maybe would be useful in those regions, but I'm not sure how they would necessarily threaten the Persian core of Iran and be able to impose a subject regime in Iran. I suppose the idea would be if we can devastate the political and economic infrastructure of the country enough and it dissolves into chaos, that would provide us with some ability, to parachute, Shah Jr. in like we did Ahmed Chalabi into Iraq. But even in Iraq, as you point out, we had to go in with ground forces to put a puppet ruler in there. So I don't know how it's going to work. Maybe I guess this is the second best thing to controlling a country or implanting a new regime is just to destroy it. Just destroy as much as we can, reduce it to chaos, and hope for the best. But that's not much of a plan either.
Yeah, that's the best there is I don't know that there is a best there, but and why would we want to do that is a second question. One last thing I want to look at for the Israeli side, though, is that is some internal issues as well. Benjamin Netanyahu has long been facing a lot of legal issues and challenges of things that have happened in the past. Well, now there's a new one to be added to it. Opposition leader Lapid on Monday accused Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu falsifying security protocols in an effort to deflect blame from himself over his government's failure on October 7th. That won't go away either. In fact, now it's starting to come out. Lapid told reporters that he wrote to Defense Ministry, Security Authority, the Prime Minister's office legal advisor, and the Defense Minister's legal advisor, demanding answers. Depending on the answers provided, the Shin Bet and the police will have to decide whether to open a new criminal investigation against Benjamin Netanyahu or against others that they may find out here. What kind of pressure this and the other ones that are already on the table that President Trump tried to get, I think it was Herzog, to pardon Netanyahu, and so he didn't have to worry about that stuff, which wasn't successful. How much does that play on whether Netanyahu tries to press Trump on Tuesday or on Wednesday to actually go to Iran?
I think on the short term it does. I mean, if you're skating across thin ice and it starts to crack, you better skate faster. I mean, if you only have one way, and that's forward, and I think that's the position he's in. For the long term, I'm not really sure. I mean, suppose that Netanyahu disappeared into the vapor tomorrow, and he was no longer the leader of Israel. How much would Israeli policy really change? I mean, I have to wonder if, just from a strategic point of view, Israel simply has this mentality. They have to be the dominant power in the Middle East and sort of our regional sub-hegemon, if you want to put it that way. And that even if Netanyahu disappeared, the imperative to destroy Iran would still exist in Israeli policy. So I think certainly for the short term and his political problems, which he's managed to, talk about an escape artist. I mean, this guy has really managed to keep himself out of what could be horrendous legal problems for a remarkably long time. Maybe it'll catch up with him eventually, or maybe very soon. But for the short term, for his own political interests, he needs to move this thing forward. But I do question, even if he were to go, how much would the strategic imperatives change all that much?
Yeah, that's a good point. Listen, in the last remaining time we have here, I want to talk about something that's more on the U.S. diplomatic side and what this may tell us about the current administration and its diplomatic prowess, if that's the right word to use. And that is Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff were recently the ones that were engaging with the Iranians in these negotiations that were happening. Well, they were also engaged with the Russians in a trilateral meeting with the Ukrainians to try to bring that war. And there was one particular day where I think in less than a 24-hour period, they were negotiating with the Iranians on the one side and with the Russians and the Ukrainians on the other side the very next day. And let me just ask you, from a diplomat yourself, can you successfully have one negotiating team that has no negotiating prowess by itself or history to navigate two really complex things. Can they do a good job with both of them?
The short answer is no, not in a normal world, but we don't live in a normal world. I mean, suppose you had some guy spend his entire life in the pharmaceutical industry, and then one day you say, "Oh, by the way, I want you to negotiate a big deal in the petroleum sector," and he doesn't know the first thing about petroleum extraction and refining or anything, but he's got to learn that on the run, and then hopefully negotiate a deal. And that's what we're doing with these two guys. But let's face it. Trump his whole background is in New York real estate business. He's got his two, New York flim flam artists out there talking to people about, oh, big deals, big money. We can make a lot of money here. He thinks the Russians, I guess, are just as corrupt and venal as all the people he knows. And then he can entice them with all sorts of deals about rebuilding Ukraine. We're going to rebuild Gaza. We're going to have Kushner land in Gaza and all these sorts of things. I think he thinks of all of these problems as something that's amenable to something as just a business transaction without addressing the strategic issues involved. And the fact that they know nothing about those issues maybe is not a problem from his point of view. So I think that's part of what's going on. Now, the good news about this, Daniel, is that it's one thing to send professional diplomats out to negotiate something if there's a coherent policy that makes sense in terms of the interests of the parties. Since there is no coherent policy or any even way to address the legitimate interests of the various policies, how can such a thing succeed? The only plus I can see for these negotiations is that whoever's sitting on the other side of the table, whether it's the Iranians, the Russians, whoever, the Ukrainians, can at least say, well, these guys have the president's ear. He's not just some guy from the State Department they've sent out there to go talk, but you're talking about two guys who can actually go back to the president and say, yeah, the president actually agrees with this. Other than that, I don't see any plus in sending these two guys out there, but that's the mode that he has chosen.
And to what extent is it a real problem? Because it seems to me that it would be. I've studied diplomacy a lot, never participated in it, so I can only look at it from the outside. But it seems like that you would want somebody. You definitely want somebody that has the president's ear and has his confidence. That's a non-negotiable. But at the same time, you want somebody who understands the nuances of the circumstances involved, especially of the parties that you're dealing with. And that would need to be a full-time job. And you would need two separate teams for Iran and for the Russia-Ukraine war instead of one that seems to be pretty light on knowledge on any of them. How much important is that?
It is important if you were discussing a real negotiation in a real world diplomatic setting that could come up with something reasonable that accommodates both sides. If you're proceeding, as we discussed earlier with General Keane and others, that this Manichaean view that, well, let's just find a way to get you to destroy yourself. How much does having a knowledge of all those things really matter? We're not living in the real world. That's the thing. That diplomacy has now become a cover for simply imposing our will on another country to the ultimate end of that country's destruction. How do you negotiate under such circumstances? It's like negotiating with Bolsheviks. I mean, we put ourselves in that position now.
Okay, well, when you say it like that, it somehow makes a little bit more sense what the administration is trying to do.
In a way, it does, doesn't it? Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of things you look at, like, for example, the whole situation in Ukraine, the Europeans. Why are they doing this? It doesn't make any sense. But if you look at it from the point of view of look at what kind of abnormal people you have there and how they operate on a domestic basis and what their fundamental motivations are, which have nothing to do with the welfare of their people, the security of their people, or coming to some reasonable accommodation to stop a conflict, then it starts to make a whole lot more sense.
Yeah, it makes more sense, but man, is that a bad harbinger of things that may come?
You bet.
Listen, I want to stick a little bit with the Russia-Ukraine war before we let you go. In the category of things that don't make sense. So the current situation here is that Ukraine side is getting pummeled left and right on the front line, in the air, in the rear areas. 5 of the 6 major cities are nearly unlivable. Hundreds of thousands have been scattered out into the hinterlands where they can get coal or just burn wood in fireplaces just to not freeze to death, etc. Everywhere you want to look, Ukraine is shrinking down. They're still not willing to make any terms. We had Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, went to Kiev just 1 week ago today and is still talking a bunch of smack about security guarantees and all kinds of stuff about its future, wonderful, whatever. Well, then we have this from the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, who over the weekend let this information out that Ukraine to open 10 weapons export centers in Europe in this year. So while he's trying to figure out how they're going to keep the lights on, and they haven't been able to, and how they're just going to survive and not lose the war on the ground, he's talking about economic things to make more weapons in Europe. What do you make of that?
I'm not clear what they're saying there. The Ukraine's going to make weapons in Europe?
That is correct. Yeah, they're going to open factories in these other countries to make weapons. And of course, they're going to make money in the other countries. And allegedly, they're going to go back to Ukraine. But that's where they're going to be done.
Well, I mean, just a few months ago, they were talking about European countries opening up production centers inside Ukraine. Now they're going to reverse it, have Ukrainian centers inside of Europe. Well, I guess one makes as much sense as the other. I think it all comes down to what Russia's end game is. I mean, as you know, a lot of people are saying that there's a lot of attrition. I mean, obviously the attrition that the Ukrainian forces are suffering is horrible. The Russians keep making steady, if rather slow progress. Although if you took it along the entire front, the progress is actually rapid and accelerating. And a lot of people are expecting at some point there will be a break, or if not a collapse, but at least a crumbling of the Ukrainian lines. But it seems that the Russian position is still their June 2024 demands: Crimea, the 4 oblasts, neutrality, and so on and so forth. I don't know how that is a viable outcome to this war, because back to what we were saying earlier about Iran, that still would depend on various promises from the Western country. We're going to lift sanctions. We're going to abide by our agreement that Ukraine will be neutral. The Russians say they won't allow any foreign forces in there, but then you have Mark Rutte saying that we're going to send forces in there as soon as there's a peace agreement signed. I don't know that the Russians have fully figured out. I hear different things from my sources that they simply cannot make a deal with anybody in the West any more than the Iranians can. That any agreement floated by the West would simply be another deception. I mean, I think it was either Marco Rubio or Pete Hegseth saying we are not aiming for a Minsk III type agreement. I think it was a deliberate lie. That's exactly what they're aiming for. They're looking for another way to put enough lipstick on a truce pig that the Russians would be tempted to kiss it, and find some way to stave off an ultimate disaster here in Ukraine. I don't know that the Russians are fully there. I think a lot of the Russians, and particularly Mr. Putin himself, want to find some way to not only have an agreement that ends the Ukraine war, but also to dramatically improve or at least normalize relationship with the United States. I think they're kidding themselves. I mean, look what just happened with the expiration of the New START agreement. All Mr. Trump would have to have done, what was it, Thursday, I guess, would have said, we will abide by these limits for another year. How hard would that have been for him to do? Yet he didn't do it. And he's not doing any of the things that he could do easily under his executive power to improve bilateral ties with Russia. And you still have these people in Moscow talking about the spirit of Anchorage. I mean, I think the dose of hopium that a lot of people are injecting themselves with in various places of the world is just unbelievable.
Well, and let's ask you another question, because you talk about some of the problems with Russia. Well, I think that negotiations and diplomacy also has to worry Kiev, because some information came out, I think it was Friday or Saturday this past week, that apparently President Trump has behind the scenes given Zelensky an ultimatum that says you will have this wrapped up by June or we're going to walk. What do you make of that?
I do have to wonder, can he walk? Can he really? I mean, if he wanted to give orders to our establishment to say, okay, no more, that center in Wiesbaden where the war is being planned, we will no longer do any strategic cooperation or planning with the Iranians, no more intelligence sharing, whatever weapons that we're selling to the Europeans to get, no more of that. We're going to cut them off entirely. Do you think he could actually make that happen? I have my doubts. I mean, any more than when his first term, when he tried to order us out of Afghanistan or Syria, he could give all sorts of orders. but nobody's going to obey them, or he'll taco out of it, even if he makes the decision to do that. So frankly, if I were Zelensky, I would not be all that concerned about it, because his real bosses are over at Langley or at MI6, not Mr. Trump.
Yeah, that's a sad state of affairs. Well, let's look at it from Trump's perspective for a second. His focus is certainly going to be on the midterms, and by June, it's when you start getting into high season. I mean, we're really already in the early stages of it, and it's not been going well for the Republican side, and all these special elections has been happening. So he's definitely going to want to try to wrap something up. But let's look at what the requirement for him would be. He would be, on the one hand, to have to say, okay, I'm just going to walk away from you guys. And of course, he would just be savaged by the left on that from just walking away. On the other hand, if he doesn't walk away and just lets it continue to meander, then even from those supporters on the right, I think that he's going to come under pressure from them too, because they're like saying, hey, wait, you said you were going to end this in a day. And now here we are closing in on the second year. You still haven't done anything. You haven't brought this thing to an end. And it's just meandering along, and the Russians are still winning. How do you see this? I mean, damned if you do, damned if you don't situation for Trump.
I was just going to say, damned if you do, damned if you don't. That's exactly the situation he's in. I suppose if I were in his shoes, I would say, well, kicking the can down the road past November is better than the alternative. And I would say the same thing about Iran, to tell the truth. If he's allowed that time by his boss, Bibi, when he comes to town, that basically attacking Iran before November is a bad idea. Letting Ukraine collapse before November is a bad idea. So there's some way he can keep this thing going, because again, he cannot have an actual agreement that actually will stand, I think, in either instance, no matter what Witkoff and Kushner are out there trying to sell to these guys. So I think that's probably the better choice of two bad choices, to just keep this thing rolling along and keep making excuses and hope that people buy it. Frankly, I think he's got bigger problems with regard to the election than either of these things are, unless they do blow up in his face. I mean, obviously, we haven't even talked about, the Epstein stuff, the stuff with ICE, the fact that how many states in this country now are trying to pack the congressional delegations by redrawing their election maps. I think he's got a lot bigger things going on with regard to the midterms than that he would if either of these things crashed on him. So I think avoiding that crash, either a big war in Iran or a collapse of the Ukrainian government. And frankly, back to Ukraine, I think in a way he's kind of a collaborator in Mr. Putin, because I think Mr. Putin actually does not want to have a military solution to this war. I think he would rather just keep turning up the heat, continuing what I could call a pedagogical policy to say, okay, have you had enough pain now? Will you now agree to our minimal terms, and hope that the other side will do that? I don't think he quite understands that that's never going to happen.
And well, what happens in the event that Trump tries to do what you suggest? And there's certainly plausible logic behind that for him in his electoral decides. But if the battlefield doesn't support that, if the battlefield doesn't support what apparently Putin may want, according to your comment there, and the Ukraine military just can't survive past this spring, and they start to have major collapses, now you don't get a choice to do anything. And now that you have to either watch the whole thing collapse and lose, or ramp it back up. So the choice may be out of Trump's hands. I mean, how likely do you see that scenario playing out before the elections happen at all?
Well, with regard to that, in Ukraine, I mean, that is largely Mr. Putin's hands. I mean, he is the one who determines the overall military policy. I mean, we've heard from various people that good military analysts, that this is being decided by the general staff, and he's basically given them a green light. I'm not sure that's entirely true. At some point, he can decide to restrain how much progress they make so that collapse doesn't occur, not only not to embarrass Mr. Trump, but also in the hopes that, well, maybe the other side will come around and sign a deal, which I think is a very false hope, but I think that that's still a strong point of view at the Kremlin. But you're right. At some point, maybe even the Russians can't contain how much damage is being done internally inside Ukraine. And they say, oh, well, hell with it. I mean, if they're going to collapse, we just have to do what we need to do. I'm not sure when or if that's going to come, or whether it would come before November.
Well, in any case, this is, you talk about a landscape fraught with landmines. I mean, this is it right now for President Trump, and you kind of alluded to it a second ago. This is largely self-imposed situation by his own creation, because he didn't take action when he could have, or early in his administration, and now he's allowed Bibi Netanyahu to navigate him into a kind of a no-win situation there. He's a damned if you don't on both of these cases, and I think he's running out of flexibility to even come up with a positive strategy should he actually develop one.
That's right, but call me a cynic, but I'm wondering how much freedom of action he ever had from the beginning. I mean, even if he'd come into office early on saying, fine, I'm going to walk away from Ukraine, as I say, could he really have done it? If he wanted to say to Bibi, hey, you're on your own, we're not going to go to where they're on your behalf, could he really have done it? I don't know, and I don't think anybody really knows except him what kind of pressures are on him, whether we're talking about Epstein or his donors, or the fact that there could always be another attempt on his life. I don't know what other pressures are on him to say, Mr. President, you do what you need to do, or we'll find somebody who will.
Well, it's all ugly. It's the bottom line. Yeah. However, we got here a lot of this. I don't want to just say it's all against President Trump, because his predecessor had a whole lot to do with both of these developments that were handed in, and I don't minimize that. But this is an American problem, and I fear that we may have, all of us on Washington especially, gotten ourselves into a no-win situation, and we just have to pray that it doesn't blow up in our faces in either one or both of them.
Exactly. And to tell the truth, Daniel, I think that's all we can do, because if you look at the political constellation in Washington, I mean, has anybody heard from Tulsi Gabbard lately? I mean, you've got, Rand Paul and Tom Massey in the Congress and the rest of them. How much sanity can you expect from anybody in Washington these days? A lot of people throw the word neocon around very loosely, say, well, they're all neocons. Well, ideologically, they're not all neocons. There are various other schools of thought or non-thought that they belong to. But when all said and done, there's very little constituency for reining in this very expansive view of American power around the world, because there's so many rice bowls that get filled here at home by having a global empire. And who was it said, it's very hard to convince of a man of something when his paycheck depends on his not understanding it. So when you have people like, General Kane and all these other people, and Yabbity on Fox News and all the rest of them calling for war, that's part of a big money-making machine that controls all of Washington and all of our policy. And I don't think, whether Trump or Kushner or Witkoff or any of those other guys are going to escape from that loop.
Well, I wish I could argue with you, but I can't. And I fear that we may have gotten ourselves into a situation where we'll get our worst case scenario somewhere, because the only thing that, in my view, can cure that condition that you just described there is to have our nose broke, or maybe our arm broke. Because I think we're going to have overextended, and only then through pain will we understand where the limits need to be. Because right now, I don't see anybody recognizing these limits. And even somebody whose instincts, like Trump, may want to, he seems powerless to be able to do anything, because he's got some weakness of his own. But this institution you talked about with all the rice bowls, I think is a good analogy there. And I fear that we're going to doom ourselves to have to pay this price in blood one of these days.
I hate to agree with you, because I really don't want to see that. I mean, I don't want to think that the only way we get out of this mess is to have a bunch of Americans killed somewhere. And the scary thing about that too is that suppose that does happen. Suppose the Iranians sink an aircraft carrier or something like that. And I worried about this with regard to Venezuela during that buildup as well. Is that how would the American people react if that happens? Will they say, "Hey, look, we did something stupid, got a bunch of Americans killed, we have to pull back"? Or they say, "Look what those dirty Iranians did. They just killed a bunch of Americans. We have to go, drop nuclear weapons on them," or something? Like we had done nothing to help lead to that outcome. I mean,
Jim, the rice bowl fillers will do everything to ensure that is the way it goes.
They'll be waving those bloody shirts everywhere. It won't be their responsibility for getting those Americans killed. It will be the dirty Iranians or the Russians or the Chinese or whoever it is that we provoked into it. Hey, it worked at Pearl Harbor. Why shouldn't it work for the next time around?
Yeah, and I calculate that all that would do was deepen the loss until one of these days we don't get to wave any bloody shirts because we're wearing them. But
I tell you, I worry about it. I think we are drifting closer and closer to a global conflict. And I think when we talk about Iran or Ukraine, I think especially if the Russians and Chinese do get involved in Iran, if that comes to pass, I think we're starting to see the various theaters of this, Eurasia versus global American thalassocratic empire starting to, come together into something a little more coherent that is a global confrontation. And, there's a lot of combustible material around, and people are basically flicking matches all over the place.
Yeah. I worry about that too. Well, we'll have to wait and see how it's going to work out, but we really appreciate you coming on today and providing these insights
Thank
here,
you.
especially with your diplomatic background and laying out the groundwork really all across the board here. So it's been a very fascinating experience, and thank you very much for coming on today.
Thank you, Dan. I really appreciate it.
And we appreciate you guys too. And we are going to have Steve Germany back on this afternoon. He's going to say there's no forcing Russia into anything. He's going to be talking about some issues with that war. It's going to be probably tailing off some of the things that Jim Jatras just told us, but he's going to look at it from a European perspective. You never want to miss Steve Germany. He always is on top of it. We will see you there at 2 p.m. today on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive. I don't try to talk you into buying gold or tell you how to run your stock portfolio, but there is a way you can help us. Subscribe, hit that like button, and share this with somebody you love.